Okay. Well, sadly, Ray was not being able to join us today. Very unusual for him. He does send his apologies. And because today we're going to have a talk by Jeffery Smith on the Grenfell Towers inquiry. Where does a public inquiry get us? So, Jeffrey, over to you.
Good morning, friends. Thank you very much. The fire at Grenfell Tower on the 14th of June 2017 killed 72 people, 18 of them children. Most died from asphyxiation after inhaling toxic smoke from the cladding on the block, which acted like a coat of petrol on the walls. Some died leaping from the building. Families died together, huddled under beds, having been told to stay where they were. Disabled residents died waiting for a rescue that never came. Every death was avoidable. Every death was the result of choices. Acts of negligence, carelessness, contempt, incompetence, and deliberate deceit made by individuals, corporations, and elected officials. The residents had the right to expect their landlord, in this case a subsidiary of local government, to ensure their homes were safe. They had the right to expect their government to enforce safety rules and to identify and combat fraud and malpractice by suppliers and fitters. Instead, those in power at every level abdicated their responsibilities. Now, friends, I'm actually reading an article from the London Review of Books, or part of it rather. And I'll just show you the front piece of this. So this is, I'm reading from that London Review of Books, published last month. Now I'll do a little bit of a screen share to show you some pictures to remind you of things. So I'm now hoping to succeed with that. And hoping that now you can see what in effect is
not yet, Jeffrey. Here it comes. Yeah.
Okay, well, just as a way of prompting people's memory, this is from the Week magazine, 3 years after the Grenfell Tower disaster. It's showing you their emblem, which is a bit like the London Underground station sign, but with a heart. And then this fearful picture of the fire. And another one. And then firemen. And that's the day after, as it were. The whole building is charred. There's the then Prime Minister talking to some firemen. That's Theresa May. And then Justice for Grenfell is a group that has been set up and have been very active. And now the tower is clad in sheeting, which with a heart at the top. And of course, it's still there in that form, I believe. So now I'm going to stop sharing and I'm just going to go back to my reading. Grenfell is a lens to see how we are governed. Stephanie Barwise, one of the lawyers for the bereaved, told the second part of the Grenfell Tower inquiry, which, among other things, dealt with the actions of elected officials. The inquiry's final report, issued on 4th of September this year, cuts a critical swathe across public and private bodies. It is a sober and dispassionate document. Its authors are all too aware that it will form the basis for future prosecutions, and its restraint seems at times too mild a response to the arrogance and incompetence displayed in the evidence. It is now indisputable that companies rigged safety tests with the complicity of the testing authorities. The politicians refused to act on safety concerns because to do so might have obstructed deregulation, that a social landlord which loathed its tenants ignored and concealed the safety notices. The report firmly established the fire as the shameful culmination of decades of failure. In his closing statement, Richard Miltlett, lead counsel for the inquiry, responsible for examining all the witnesses and ensuring its terms of reference were addressed, presented a spider's web of blame. The image showed a tangle of arrows going between Kensington and Chelsea Council, testing bodies, architects, manufacturers, and construction companies. It's almost impossible to decipher, and that was his point. Each arrow represented one party's attempt to shift responsibility to another and back again. A sorry repetition of the merry-go-round of buck passing that Millet argued had characterized the first phase of the inquiry. I'll now show you, I hope to show you a picture of the web of blame. Sorry about that, I have to find the web of blame. Oh, now I'm hoping that you're seeing a web of blame. Do anyone see that?
Not yet, not yet. Yes, coming. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. I'm not going to try and explain this, but in the middle of it, you see Arconic, who are the people, is the company that made the cladding. To the left, on the left side, you see Studio E, who are the architects. Down to the bottom right, it says RBKC. That's the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. So just to give you an impression of that, I've now stopped sharing and I'll continue reading. In countries with sophisticated regulatory regimes, catastrophes such as Grenfell ought to be impossible. When they occur, they are invariably multi-causal, the result of many overlapping failures. This complexity is often taken to be exculpatory and used by guilty parties to muddy the issue of responsibility. Lawyers for the bereaved ask the inquiry not to get entangled in this web, but instead to begin to apportion the degree of responsibility borne by the various parties. The final report assigns considerable or very significant responsibility for the fire to the contractors and subcontractors who executed the refurbishment. The first phase of the inquiry, which reported in October 2019, was concerned with establishing what happened on the night of the fire, how it started, how it engulfed the building, and the response of the London Fire Brigade. It established what is now a familiar story. During a council commission refurbishment between 2012 and 2016, Grenfell Tower was fitted with unsafe, flammable cladding and combustible insulation. An ordinary appliance an ordinary appliance fire on the 4th floor moved through a window frame and lit this outer skin. Toxic smoke rapidly filled the building. The first phase report acknowledged the heroism of individual firefighters, while sharply criticising the London Fire Brigade's failure to abandon its stay put advice or to prepare contingency plans for situations in which that strategy might fail. Many of those who died would have survived had it been abandoned earlier. The testimony provided by firefighters at the scene made clear that nobody at Grenfell that evening understood what kind of fire they were seeing or had been trained for it. Later evidence revealed that Arconic, the cladding manufacturer, had been told a decade before the fire that fitting a large tower block with polyethylene core panels would be equivalent to attaching a 19,000-litre oil tanker to the outside of the building. The potentially lethal consequences were perfectly clear to Arconic's senior management. Quote, "What will happen if only one building made out of PE core is on fire and will kill 60 to 70 persons?" One manager asked in an internal memo. What is the responsibility of the ACM supplier? ACM being aluminium composite panel. The second phase of the inquiry had the more expansive task of establishing how, in 21st century London, a reinforced concrete building, itself structurally impervious to fire, could be turned into a death trap that would enable fire to sweep through it in an uncontrollable way in a matter of a few hours. The evidence uncovered in pursuing that question has received less press attention than it should have. Public inquiries cannot determine civil or criminal liability, but the report makes devastating criticisms of every public and private body involved with the tower and its refurbishment. At a national level, politicians from multiple governments, Labour, Conservative, the Liberal Democrat Conservative coalition, and civil servants failed to act on fire safety and regulation. Two former Prime Ministers, Blair and Cameron, have already tried to spin their way out of criticism. These parties can be divided into those that were malign through intention and those that were malign through incompetence, with some falling into both categories. Incompetence is not a lesser category when safety is concerned, especially when knowingly indulged. Theresa May, Prime Minister at the time of the fire, announced the inquiry on 15th of June, the day after the disaster, and accepted without quarrel the terms that Martin Moore-Bick, the retired appellate judge chosen as chair, proposed. In a letter to May in August 2017, Moore-Bick noted that some of those affected thought the inquiry's scope should include social housing policy more generally, as well as covering the local authority, the tenant management organisation, and their actions in the aftermath. He demurred at the time from addressing broad questions of a social, economic and political nature, preferring to consider the precise events of the night and the conditions that gave rise to the fire. Some survivors, especially those represented by the solicitor Imran Khan, who also represented the family of Stephen Lawrence, persistently raised the question of institutional racism and discrimination. More than 3/4 of the tower's residents were non-white. The issue surfaces somewhat defensively in Moore-Bick's preface. Although such considerations were outside the inquiry's terms, he notes that he found some evidence of prejudice in the response to the fire, but no evidence that homes were deliberately allocated to those of non-white ethnicity in a building known to be dangerous. nor did he uncover evidence that decisions to cut corners or to delay remedial safety work were motivated by racial or social prejudice. Yet the contempt with which the TMO treated its residents, its serious failure to observe its basic responsibilities, is difficult to explain other than as a diffuse consequence of class superiority and callousness. Statutory inquiries have become an increasingly common means of addressing scandals and crises in Britain. Some have resulted in serious and enduring change. The regime of DBS checks for child safety is a direct result of the Bickard inquiry into the Soho murders. Others, such as the post-Savile independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and the ongoing undercover policing inquiry, have failed to answer questions, have failed to find answers, and lost the trust of the groups that they were supposed to serve. The Grenfell Tower inquiry has been one of the most complex and expensive ever undertaken, costing £200 million, including legal expenses, and involving 638 core participants. The disclosure of 320,000 documents and hundreds of hours of testimony and cross-examination conducted over 7 years, a period extended by the pandemic, but not unusual among contemporary inquiries. The 1,700-page report on the second phase seems relatively concise. Questions about scope, duration, and cost follow in the wake of public inquiries. Politicians might initiate an inquiry to establish the facts about an event and to determine how it can be avoided in future. But they are also convenient means of removing the issue from public debate. Quotes, "We must wait for the inquiry to report," deserves a spot in ministerial bingo. At its inception, many families feared that the inquiry would be drawn out, establishment whitewash, or that it would spread the blame so wide that nobody would be held accountable. Neither has proved the case. A third anxiety that time would dull the public's appetite for justice is harder to allay. It takes an effort to recall the anger so widely felt the morning after the fire, when the burning tower seemed to represent so much that was wrong with Britain's social and political order, its private affluence and public squalor, the avarice and arrogance of its ruling elite. The story established by the inquiry is shocking in its detail, but unsurprising in its general shape, and perhaps this helps explain the rapid decline in press interest. The detailed earlier accounts have been succeeded by indifferent silence. Grenfell happened because many British institutions have been progressively hollowed out, including the press. The kind of local journalism that might have uncovered and campaigned against the problems at Grenfell, many residents had sought again and again to have them redressed, is long dead. Few papers at city or national level could afford regular reporting on the inquiry or the fire's causes and aftermath. The apportioning of blame depends in part on where you begin the story. When the coroner investigated the Lakanal fire, when the coroner investigating the Lakanal fire wrote to the Department with safety recommendations. Now, this is a Lakanal fire was in 1991, when a number of people were killed in a relatively smaller fire at a block called Lakanal House in South London. So when the coroner investigating the Lakanal fire wrote to the department with safety recommendations, including the installation of sprinkler systems and a systematic review of regulations, Martin told his colleagues, "We only have a duty to respond to the coroner. not to kiss her backside. The coroner's letter was addressed to the minister in charge of the department, Eric Pickles, the Cameron-era axeman who once accused those complaining about government cuts as shroud waving. Pickles' contemptuous evidence to the inquiry was its lowest point. He told the Inquiry Council not to waste his time. I do have an extremely busy day meeting people. And confused the number of dead with Hillsborough. His irritability was prompted by questioning that focused on the Cameron government's deregulation drive. Martin told the inquiry, Martin is a civil servant, by the way. Mr. Martin told the inquiry that regulation was a dirty word in the department. Pickles insisted that safety regulations were exempt from the government's one in, two out deregulatory drive, an assertion the inquiry found was flatly contradicted by the evidence of his officials and by the contemporaneous documents. The report is clear that the pressure within the department to reduce red tape was so strong that it prevented a proper response to the Lacanal Fire coroner's recommendations, which included a revision of the regulations on cladding. The Moore-Bick report says that the Pickles department was poorly run. According to one of his ministers, he regarded the department's officials as Guardian reading pinkos. The Grenfell testimony week arose from the £150 million civil settlement between the survivors and the corporates and civic parties involved in the fire. Company executives and government officials were requested to attend, carefully separated from the survivors, families and press. In adjoining rooms, work by survivors hung alongside video documentation of forensic architecture's reconstruction of the fire. On successive evenings, the families, the corporate parties and the press were invited to watch the final half-hour documentary, a synthesis of footage and survivor recollections mapping the spread of the fire through the tower. The evening I saw it, the room remained in silence afterwards. Most of the 23 defendants in the case sent representatives. This is to the Grenfell Tower testimony week. Arconic extended the contempt it had shown throughout the inquiry by refusing to send anyone. The company was represented by 3 empty chairs. Michael Gove, Secretary of State for the Environment at the time of the fire, attended one session. Press attendance was sporadic, save for Peter Apps. Each day began and ended with a reading of the names of the 72 dead. I'm now turning the page because I'm reading less than half of this 10,000 word account. The most shocking evidence heard by the inquiry concerned the manufacturers and testing bodies. The report's final judgment is that all the companies involved were guilty of systematic dishonesty, which eroded the system of standards supposed to protect citizens. Arconic's flammable cladding has received the most attention in the press, although the toxic smoke from the insulation behind the cladding panels played a significant role in the deaths at Grenfell. The report makes clear that Arconic also manipulated the testing regime, concealing results that should have seen the cladding taken off the market long before it was put on the tower. One of their executives' internal messages are damning. They reveal that the managers of Arconic knew about the dangers of polyethylene core cladding years before Grenfell was refurbished. In his response to a safety query from a Spanish manufacturer, they said that the fact they had been They said that the fact they had not managed to have the cassette panels certified to Spain's minimum standard, Euroclass B, should be kept very confidential. Arconic is a US-owned multinational, but operates in Europe through a French subsidiary. Several of its executives hid behind an arcane French law to avoid attending the inquiry. This statute was intended to protect French citizens and companies from the aggressive disclosure practices of American antitrust law. We're now talking about the tenant management organisation. Unlike most such organisations which handle a single building or an estate, the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation ran all of the borough's housing stock, nearly 10,000 units. Kensington and Chelsea's Tory councillors barely appear in the report. The council's ideological motivations were outside the inquiry's terms. While it omits broader questions of political responsibility, the report describes a succession of failures by Ryden, the refurbishment's main contractor, and the subcontractor responsible for the cladding, Harley Facades. The project's architects, Studio E, and their fire consultants, Exova. The report characterises these as acts of negligence, omission, and carelessness towards contractual responsibilities, attributing to them considerable or very significant responsibility for the fire. Ryden's appointment as main contractor for the project was irregular, even improper. Although Ryden had put in the lowest bid for the project, the tenant management organisation wanted to save £800,000. Before appointing Ryden, it conducted clandestine meetings to guarantee this reduction. Morbick's report makes 58 recommendations to the government. Some would be transformative, such as sweeping away the fragmented and dysfunctional regulatory landscape and replacing it with a single construction regulator reporting to a single Secretary of State. Welcoming the report in Parliament, Keir Starmer promised to study the recommendations and respond in full within 6 months. For the survivors, nothing short of criminal charges and prison sentences for those responsible will be seen as justice. Potential charges mooted by the police range from fraud and misconduct in public affairs to manslaughter. Making criminal inferences from the inquiry report, even where it assigns responsibility, is difficult given the differing burdens of proof. The Attorney General gave an undertaking in 2020 that no individual giving more evidence to the inquiry would have that evidence used against them. Gillian Koenig, a former Grenfell resident, wrote in her book Catastrophe and Systemic Change in 2021 that one of the reasons the state fails to learn the lessons of disaster is the difficulty in making the water visible. The phrase comes from the old story of one fish asking another, "What's water?" A way of talking about conditions so pervasive that can no longer be perceived. Most high-rise buildings more than 18 metres high have been remedied. I'll come back to that because the answer is they haven't. But even identifying all of the medium-rise buildings, those more than 11 metres high, clad in ACM panelling, has been difficult. Taken with the other inquiries that ran alongside it, on infected blood, child sexual abuse, mental health deaths, undercover policing, a picture emerges of a country that is consistently failing its vulnerable or dependent citizens who have no way to voice their complaints and no one to champion their cause. And that is all too unwilling to confront or constrain the powerful. In his closing remarks to the part of the inquiry that heard accounts of each death in detail, the QC Millett remarked that the panel might be struck by the vast distances between the final terrible experiences of those who died and the technical decisions made by testing houses and manufacturers and local authorities. Yet every decision, every act, omission, interpretation, understanding, practice, policy, protocol affects someone somewhere, someone who is unknown and unseen, but who is an adored child. But who is an adored child, a beloved sister, a respected uncle, a needed mother. Distance has characterized the Grenfell story from the start. Distance from power, consideration, and redress. Yet the most terrible and unjust distance now seems to be time. On the anniversary of the fire this year, survivors carried placards that read, "This much evidence, still no charges." Every death at Grenfell was foreseeable. Every death was avoidable. For every death, therefore, someone is responsible. It's always the same thing everywhere. We suffer and they prosper. Carrie Masilli, whose uncle died in the fire, told the inquiry. The system isn't broken. It was built this way. Only prosecutions will prove him wrong.
Oh, thank you, Jeffrey. I was stunned into total silence by that. It was such a shocking, utterly shocking episode in our history. Would anyone like to ask Jeffrey about any of the points that he's made? I just need to change my view so I can see everybody, which I can't right now. Patty, you're muted at the moment.
Yeah, just got a couple. I'm not sure why that's echoing like mad. Okay, just got a couple of things. When Keir Starmer promised a full response in 6 months, I mean, I more or less laughed out loud at the time. 6 months is nothing in this kind of massive process. I just thought, I mean, it was pie in the sky.
Well, we wait and see, won't we? 6 months is up in next March.
Yeah. Okay, all right, then that's that.
My hunch that there will be a response. Whether it will be an adequate response is the real issue.
And another one is, so what prosecutions are underway?
As far as I know, none. The police have been watching all this. after the report came out, which is just 6 weeks ago or so, journalists were asking that question to the police, and they were saying that they got a team working on it. The gist of it seemed to be that it would be at least 6 months before they could start thinking about placing charges. So if you add a year or two onto that for the legal proceedings, we get to about 9 years after the fire then. Just as an ancillary thought, corporate manslaughter is an offence, but proving it is usually thought of as very difficult, unless it's a very small company, in which case Fred allowed a manslaughter situation to occur because he was the only one running the company, as it were. Once it's a big company, it almost seems as if they need a minute saying, we don't mind if people are killed. It's as stupid as that, it seems to me.
Well, thank you for that.
And of course, Arconic is an American company, part of, I think, Saint-Gobain, which is a French company. Some of the other companies are the same. Some of the products are being taken over by one company from another company.
And still made?
Apparently. Well, I mean, in fact, I can, in the London Review of Books published, which came in the post yesterday morning, there's a letter about a fire in Spain 2 months ago, in which several people and numerous cats and dogs were killed because it was clad in this type of material. So there has been an instance of almost a repeat of Grenfell, but not quite as severe, and that was in another country. I did allude to the fact that this James Butler, who wrote this article in LRB, seems to think that all clad buildings have been identified. But in the last few weeks, in the last fortnight, I've read articles in The Guardian and The Telegraph, more or less saying that less than half of those have been identified, because you can't not even the most experienced surveyor can be sure by walking along the street and looking up what type of cladding has been added to a building which was perhaps originally built in 1970. So kind of some degree of testing is needed of all the materials to know that, which implies getting it to high levels outside these buildings. So, I don't want to. I'm trying not to predict that there might be another example of this sort of fire.
Yeah, yeah.
I used to be a consulting engineer, but I retired 10 years ago. So if I hadn't retired, I'd have been called in on things like that. I mean, a friend of mine about 4 years ago said that she had a friend who couldn't sell their flat because it was covered in this type of material. And there are scores and scores of tower blocks where people have bought a flat, and now it transpires that the cladding, they've got this sort of cladding, so it's worth zero, and so they can't sell it and move on. And whether they've got used to sleeping at night yet, I don't know, but I'm sure they've had sleepless nights. I'm sure they have had sleepless nights. Just as a background, I think Scotland sorted all this out about 10 years ago. So you might be safe for moving to Scotland if you want to live in a tall building.
How did they sort it out, Jeffrey? What did they do?
Oh, well, I've only read bits of that, but there was a fire in southwest Scotland about 20 years ago, and a Scottish MP or MSP made a big fuss about it. And I believe the Scottish Parliament addressed the issue and set about identifying similar buildings. Of course, I mean, there are probably only relatively proportionately fewer such buildings in Scotland, so they might have had a proportionately smaller task.
Yeah.
But I believe that they've reclad those. And indeed, I mean, I could turn around my head now and look at a building in central Bristol that was reclad about 3 years ago. It's right in overlooking Castle Park. So recladding has been done. And as I recall it, the government, when it was Conservative, Michael Gove tried to embarrass the building companies into doing something about it. And to some degree, there's been a bit of success there. And some of the building companies have gone around and said, we clad that building in 10 years ago, we'd better go back and reclad it in some safe material. Of course, recladding it, you have to scaffold it all. It's a seven-figure sum, probably. Anyway, in England, there's England and Wales, but mainly in England, I think there are quite an embarrassingly large number still in existence.
Muted. Sorry. You mentioned that the inquiry said responsibility when your web of guilt that you showed, responsibility went largely to the contractors. And I'm a little bit surprised by that. I would have thought that, they're not the manufacturers of the contractor is responsible to build the building as specified, surely. And whether they do what, I don't think a contractor can make a building more flammable if
They're doing what
without
they were told to do.
specified materials. What do you think about that?
Well, as I read it just today, I thought that's not the case. Others are responsible too. So that is the author of this article in LRB, I think. And give all fairness to this chap, James Butler. It's a highly complex issue, and he's read 1,700 pages, we assume. But in fact, the architects, Studio E, are very much blamed. Of course, they wound up the week after. So there's 2 or 3 individuals somewhere, possibly in London, who took on this project, making out that they had the necessary skills to do it. But it's clear from the questioning. I've read the report in part. I've got a PDF. I got it the morning it was published in September. And it's clear that the architects got the job, even though they'd never done a job remotely like that before. So that implies that who gave them the job? Well, that was the tenant management organisation. So they weren't working in correct terms of reference either.
Jeffrey, the quote you read, the system's not broken, it was built that way. Yeah. That was a survivor who said that, am I right? Yeah.
Yes. Somebody who's been very much in the protest group since, Karim Morsili. The last 2 sentences I'll read again. Karim Morsili, whose uncle died in the fire, told the enquiry, "The system isn't broken. It was built this way. Only prosecution will prove him wrong," is the author's comment. There have been some correspondence in London Review of Books since, And indeed, I wrote a letter to them, and they wrote back saying they were considering publishing it. It's not being published, but it might be published still, because they've had in 2 issues since, they've had letters about Grenfell. The first letter about Grenfell was from somebody who's general secretary or equivalent of an organisation called Inquest. Now, that seems to be a group of people whose relatives have died in dreadful circumstances, which the government, we thought, was protecting them against. So this organisation, Inquest, does exist. And their comment is that, who is it that, well, I think they think there should be some overriding body whose job it is to tick off when recommendations are being followed. The other letter is in yesterday's. I referred to that. That is about a fire in Valencia in Spain in the last 2 months. So as well as flooding, they've had a nasty fire. If they publish my letter, I refer to the fact that the government abolished the system of building control that applied in London in 1984 because, as I put it, a prime minister could not stomach a left-wing leader of the Greater London Council. So they abolished GLC, and that meant they abolished the district surveyors network. District surveyors were very unusually capable people. They had qualified fully both as a surveyor and as a structural engineer, and the district surveyor of Westminster was thought of as on a par with the professor of civil engineering at Imperial College. So I've got a very short letter that might appear in this debate in a fortnight's time or so.
And where would this be published, Jeffrey?
In the London Review of Books, which is published every fortnight. So it's a bit like the Times Literary Supplement, reviewing new books. But the angle by London Review of Books is, for a start, most of their reviews are something like 10,000 words. So typically, they have a very expert commentator who will tell you a lot about the history of the topic and then what the new book says about the topic. So you can get a good sort of background. Anyway, you should be able to get it at W.H. Smith's. If you can't, I'll come back to me. I'll try and find a way you can get it. This is it.
Oh, yeah.
Is there something?
The back of it, it's got lots of advice from American university publishing houses. It's not unrelated to the New York Review of Books, but it's been going for 30 years in Britain.
Is there something that you feel that we can or should do about this, Jeffrey? And I can think of buildings that are clad with foam products, and I know that it's possible to get even petrochemical foams with fire retardants in them. Is it? And is that true? And does it work? And then how do you tell the difference between a foam that would burn and one that doesn't without applying a torch to a building or chopping a bit of the
I'm not quite sure what you're suggesting. Are you suggesting that there might be a kind of miracle product that can be applied over the top of it all, and then we're all safe?
Not at all. I'm suggesting that there is.
Oh, all right.
I'm suggesting that there are chemicals that can be added to the foam itself in its manufacturing process. I'm wondering if you know about that, because as I understand, there's a price difference between the panels that are harder to set alight and the ones that are not protected, and the more fire retardant fire resistant ones are more expensive, and people take a cheaper one then. And I don't know. I don't know whether I'm telling truth here or just passing on a rumor that I heard.
Well, I think you're right that there are products that could have been used that were not highly inflammable. That were not, going back, but you see, I've been retired 10 years, so I've not really followed things ever so much in that time. But 30 or 40 years ago, I remember a colleague who was involved in testing some cladding, and that meant doing a full-scale fire test on cladding. And that meant that they had to simulate 3 stories of a tower block and put their proposed cladding around a corner of such a thing. And it was done at Cardington in Bedfordshire, where there was the big airship hangar still remains, where airships were kept until they went wrong. And that is still in existence, that building. It was, in fact, I think it was owned by a building research establishment, which used to be a government body and had been going since the 1920s under that or another name. Anyway, fire tests were done on cladding 40 years ago. And but I mean, I don't want to sound too much as if I'm getting at a certain prime minister, but or a certain party, but 10 years ago, lots of right-wing newspapers were saying, get rid of red tape, it's bad for you. And look what happens, they got rid of red tape, and it was not bad for the people who died at Grenfell. And that's alluded to in here. I don't think the word red tape comes in, because they're all sort of proper people who ran the enquiry. But a political angle on it is that. I think you mentioned, is there something Quakers can do? Well, yeah. Quakers have at times been able to do something that's made a big change in society. I'm not quite sure that building construction or remedial works is something that Quakers could really get into. I do remember once, about 40 years ago, going to a residential yearly meeting, and in the queue for lunch, there was somebody from one of the big builders whose name will come to me. It turned out he was a Quaker. So there are reputable builders around, or were, but of course nowadays, well, I mean, that was although it was a big company, it was a sort of family company still. Nowadays, so many companies are owned by shareholders, and company law seems to be that the duty of the company is to make a profit for its shareholders. If they can avoid killing people in the process, well and good, sort of thing.
Anyone else got anything that they'd like to bring up with Jeffrey? I think we're sort of a bit. I am anyway, quite stunned and shocked, because it really brings home something which shouldn't have faded away from my conscience, but I'm afraid had rather. So thank you very much, Jeffrey. It was so interesting. And of course, we shall all be able to read it again, and to as will friends who couldn't make it to this particular sort of hands-on meeting, because David will be making sure that it's available to us all online within a day or two, ongoing on his usual speed anyway. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, friends. Thank you very much for coming and listening.
Jeffrey, thanks. Very well informed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Next week, bit mysterious. Two friends will be discussing their experiences of Quakerisms. Next week, your participation is most keenly requested because the two friends in question, they want to initiate discussion as well as simply give their own views and experiences. So it's very important that you come if you possibly can next week and encourage other friends to come too, please. Thank you very much.
Who is it, Patsy? Who are the two friends, or is that to remain a secret?
I think it's meant to be a secret.
Okay.
Keep it.
I think so. I've not been told otherwise, so I think I'd better.
Okay. We'll find out next Friday. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody, and especially Jeffrey. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Bye.